The bolt of fabric measured exactly 54 inches wide and 40 yards long. It was tagged, sealed, and loaded before dawn. 14 Confederate checkpoints stood between that wagon and the Union Depot outside Nashville. Every inspector who handled that bolt over the following 9 days did the same thing. He pressed his palm flat against the surface, lifted one corner, noted the weight, read the lot number, and passed it through. Not one of them turned the bolt to its edge. Not one of them looked at the narrow woven border running the full length of the cloth. Not one of them understood that sewn into that border, in a band no wider than a thumb, was a complete inventory of Confederate troop positions across 3 Georgia counties. The woman who put them there was 23 years old. She earned 62 cents a day. Her name appears in no military record on either side of the war. Crisis opening. The Findlay Cotton Works ran 19 hours a day in the summer of 1862. Not because the market demanded it, because the Confederate Army did. The mill sat on the western bank of the Ocmulgee River in Macon, Georgia, a 3-story brick building that had been producing civilian textiles since 1851 and had been converted to war supply manufacturing in February of 1862, 11 weeks after Georgia's governor sent a requisition letter to every operating mill in the state. The letter described the request as a matter of urgent patriotic necessity, a phrase that appeared 4 times across 3 paragraphs and meant, in practical terms, that refusal was not an option. By July, 340 workers were running 112 looms across 2 packed floors. The upper floor reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit on clear afternoons. The noise, a continuous, merciless percussion of shuttle throws and harness pulls, swallowed conversation at distances greater than 4 feet. Workers learned to communicate in gestures, in mouthed syllables, in the compressed physical shorthand of people who share a space too loud for words. They learned to read each other's faces across the width of a room. They learned, without ever discussing it, exactly when a supervisor was watching and when he was not. Nora Gill had been on the upper floor for 14 months. Loom 7. A 48-inch broadloom that produced cotton yardage at approximately 11 yards per hour at full speed. She had learned it from a woman named Mrs. Addie Cook, the floor's longest-serving trainer, who moved among the machinery with a calm that seemed almost defiant, given the conditions. Mrs. Cook had a saying she repeated to every new hand, delivered without ceremony in the 5 seconds between shuttle passes. The loom doesn't care what you're thinking, but it will show everyone what you did. Nora Gill had been turning that sentence over in her mind for 14 months. In June of 1862, she began to believe it was the most important thing anyone had ever told her. The crisis arrived quietly. On the 9th of June, a Confederate supply sergeant named Calhoun Pratt came to the loading dock with a procurement order for 200 yards of standard supply cotton. He was 31 years old, assigned to the Macon Regional Depot, and known at the mill as a routine procurement contact. He appeared 6 to 8 times a month. He was unremarkable in every visible way. He was also, though nothing in his uniform indicated it, a courier for a Union intelligence network operating out of Chattanooga, and he had been passing information southward through a chain of concealed message drops for 6 months without a single compromise. As Nora countersigned his order, he spoke 4 words in a register below the loom noise without looking at her. They found the drops Every concealed message location in the network, the broken fence post, the hollow tree, the loose brick behind the river mill, had been identified. The entire courier system was burned. Pratt left the dock at 9:14 in the morning, and she did not see him again for 11 weeks. She had 14 days of accumulated intelligence in her memory and no way to move any of it. Background. To understand what Nora Gill did next, it is necessary to understand what she was, not just what she knew. She had grown up 18 miles north of Macon, the daughter of a journeyman carpenter and a woman who kept a kitchen garden and knew the names of every plant in the county, useful or otherwise. The family was not wealthy. They were not destitute. They occupied the vast middle ground of antebellum Georgia rural life that generated almost no documentary record because they owned nothing significant enough to dispute, tax, or memorialize. Historians sometimes call this stratum the invisible majority. The term is accurate. She received 4 years of formal schooling at a one-room school operated by a man named Mr. Bascom, who taught from September to February each year and filled the other months with carpentry work. He was a precise, undemonstrative teacher who set high standards with very few words. In one letter recovered from a Macon church archive, he described his student body in the winter of 1851 as ordinary children of ordinary circumstance, with the exception of one girl of about 11 years who appears to see the structure of a thing before she sees the thing itself. He did not record her name in that letter. He did not need to. There was only one girl in the room. What Bascom had noticed, and what no one else would name for another decade, was that Nora Gill perceived patterns the way other people perceived color, automatically, without effort. It was not a skill she had developed. It was a quality of attention she had always possessed, and she had never thought of it as unusual because she had no basis for comparison. She simply noticed that things repeated. That repetition implied structure. That structure, once identified, could be used. At 19, she came to Macon following a cousin who had found work at the Findlay mill. She was hired within a week and placed on the floor to learn by proximity, which was standard practice. Within 3 months, she was running her own loom. Within 8 months, she was the person new workers were stationed beside. She had never asked for any of it. The competence was simply visible the way candlelight is visible in a room without windows, whether the candle intends to be seen or not. By March of 1862, she had been passing condensed intelligence to Pratt's network for 5 months. The method was simple. A strip of paper, never more than 3 lines of text, tucked inside the broken fence post on Elm Street between the mill and her boarding house. Troop counts, supply weights, depot departure times. The numbers printed on Confederate procurement seals. Practical, specific, reliable. Pratt's network had described her information in a report she would not read for 80 years as the most consistent single source below the Savannah corridor. Then the drops were burned, and the network was gone. And the only intelligence still moving was the kind locked inside a woman's memory, standing at a loom on a floor too loud for conversation, with 14 days before what she knew became obsolete. She had 9 days to solve the problem of how to move it. The problem. The problem was geometric before it was anything else. Every bolt produced at the Findlay mill was inspected twice before it cleared the loading dock. The first inspection was conducted by the mill's internal quality checker. A man named Sims, who examined surface texture, measured width, and checked lot markings. The second was conducted by the Confederate Army's procurement clerk, a man named Josiah Wyeth, who arrived each Monday and Thursday morning with a clipboard and a stamp. Wyeth was methodical. He ran his hand across every bolt. He verified measurements against the manifest. On 2 occasions in the past 3 months, he had cut into a sealed bolt to investigate suspected yardage padding. His interior examination rate on flagged bolts was approximately 40%. A physical note concealed inside a bolt would be found. The risk was not theoretical, it was demonstrated. And physically carrying intelligence north was equally impossible. Nora had no civilian travel permit, no military affiliation, and no plausible reason to move between Macon and Nashville in the middle of a war. The 340-mile route passed through 14 checkpoints where travelers were stopped, documented, questioned, and searched. A woman of her background traveling alone would be interrogated at the first of those 14 stops and would not reach the second. The contact in Nashville, a Union quartermaster officer whose name Pratt had given her as Henshaw, was in position and waiting. The corridor existed. The receiver existed. There was simply no way to send anything along it. Nora Gill spent 9 days thinking. She worked her full shifts. She did not change her behavior, her rhythm, or her pace at any point that a supervisor or coworker might have observed. She ate her meals and returned to her boarding house. And in the hours between, she worked through the problem the way she worked through anything, by identifying its structure first, before attempting its solution. She ruled out 3 approaches before she found the one. Her first idea was chemical. She had overheard a conversation between 2 supervisors about commercial fabric watermarking, the practice of treating threads with compounds invisible in normal light. If specific threads could be treated to become readable under heat or moisture, the information could be carried on the surface of the cloth itself without any visible alteration. She abandoned the idea within 48 hours. She had no access to watermarking compounds. She had no controlled method of application. And she had no way to ensure that Henshaw, at the receiving end, would have any means to reveal them. Her second approach was structural. Every loom produces a weave, a calculated interlacing of vertical warp threads and horizontal weft threads, deliberately introducing small controlled variations in the weave pattern. A dropped float here, a reversed twill there, at regular intervals, could encode a binary sequence readable to someone who knew what to look for. It was technically achievable on Loom 7. She had worked out the theoretical framework in one long evening at her boarding house table. Then she remembered Wyeth's hands. He ran them across every surface. A structural deviation in the weave would register as a defect against his palm the way a splinter registers against a finger. Not always, but reliably enough. He had already rejected 2 bolts in 3 months for surface irregularities. Abandoned. Her third approach was closer. Thread density, the number of threads per inch, could theoretically be varied in specific zones without any visible surface change. A thread count variation cipher could be sophisticated, stable, and entirely invisible to the naked eye. The problem was that decoding it required a thread count tool, a specific, calibrated tool that was not standard equipment at a military quartermaster depot, and there was no way to send instructions to Henshaw about what tool to acquire without already having a working communication method. The approach required itself to work. Abandoned. The answer came from Mrs. Cook's sentence. It had been sitting in the back of Nora's mind for 9 days, and on the 9th evening it surfaced with the particular clarity of an idea that had been waiting for permission. The loom will show everyone what you did, not what you hid, what you did. And what she had been doing for 14 months, automatically without thought, as a routine feature of every single bolt she had ever produced, was weaving a selvage edge. The discovery: every bolt of cloth ever woven has a selvage. It is the reinforced border strip running along the length of the fabric, the edge that prevents unraveling, the structural margin that holds the weave intact. It is the most overlooked part of any bolt in existence. Inspectors look at the face, they look at the weight, they look at the width and the surface texture. The selvage edge is purely functional and functionally invisible. On a 54-inch bolt, the selvage measured approximately 3/8 of an inch. It required its own separate threading sequence. Nora had been running it on automatic reflex without conscious attention for over a year. She had complete control of every thread in it. The Findlay mill maintained 7 standard thread colors for selvage production, kept uniformly stocked across all floors because different product lines required different selvage specifications. Most bolts used only 1 or 2, but all 7 were available, and their presence on a floor was unremarkable. Nora's cipher assigned a category of military information to each of the 7 colors. Natural undyed thread carried troop count ranges. Dark brown designated a geographic zone. Charcoal gray indicated direction of movement. Rust specified supply type. A dull blue, produced from an indigo dye that the mill used for a civilian line, now discontinued, but whose dye stock remained. Encoded depot designation. A pale yellow from onion skin mordant used in specialty orders carried time references. The 7th color was a mixed rust gray, a production byproduct that appeared occasionally in selvage cord when thread ends were spliced. She designated it as a confirmation signal, or a repeat marker. The sequence in which these colors appeared in the selvage, read left to right beginning 4 inches from the bolt's tag end, encoded a complete intelligence entry. A full 40-yard selvage could carry approximately 200 distinct color position entries, enough to encode troop positions, movement corridors, supply depot inventories, and departure schedules across an entire regional operation. She wrote the cipher key on a piece of oilcloth measuring 3 inches by 5 inches, in pencil pressed hard enough to survive wetting. She made 2 copies. One went inside her mattress. The second had to reach Henshaw in Nashville before the first bolt did, and it had to travel a different route. She found that route in a loading dock conversation she had stored months earlier, without any specific plan for using it. Unionist families relocating to Union-controlled territory were permitted to ship personal household goods through the military supply system under a civilian transit permit, subject to a weapons and currency inspection, but not a materials analysis. Their bundles were physically examined at point of departure and then passed through with a transit seal. Among the families with an active permit in July of 1862 was a household named Tremaine, scheduled to depart Macon for Nashville within the week. She did not know the Tremaines. She identified their outbound shipment from the loading dock manifest 4 days before their departure. On a Thursday morning, during a 7-minute window when the dock supervisor was counting inventory at the far end of the warehouse, she folded a linen curtain panel around the oilcloth cipher key and added it to the Tremaine family's bundle. The total time, under 90 seconds. On the inside hem of the curtain panel, she had written 11 words in her tight, careful hand. Read the edge. Begin 4 inches from the tag end. The colors tell the story. 11 days later, the first cipher bolt left the Findlay dock before sunrise on a Confederate supply wagon. First success. Lot 441-C, 40 yards, 54-inch width, standard supply grade. Confederate seal number 7703. The manifest listed it as tent lining material, which was accurate. The face of the bolt was exactly that, nothing more. Along its selvage edge, in a sequence that began 4 inches past the tag end and ran 187 entries down the length of the cloth, was a complete order of battle for Confederate forces positioned between Macon and Chattanooga as of July 3rd, 1862. Including unit strengths, supply routes, ammunition depot locations, and the scheduled movement of 2 cavalry divisions that Union scouts had been trying to track for 6 weeks. 14 checkpoints. 0 seconds of selvage examination. The bolt arrived at the Nashville depot on July 12th. A clerk named James Henshaw, not the officer Pratt had described, but his assistant, a 24-year-old from Coshocton, Ohio, pulled the curtain panel from a separate pile of civilian transit goods and unfolded the oilcloth key. He read the 11 words on the hem lining. He took bolt 441-C off the supply rack, found the selvage edge, counted 4 inches from the tag end, and began reading. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, he had decoded 187 entries and produced a handwritten intelligence summary that covered 9 full pages. He sent it to the signals section with a single notation at the top. Source: Macon Corridor. Method: Fabric Selvage Cipher. Originator unknown. Recommend classification: eyes only. The Union signals officer who received the summary read it twice, cross-referenced it against 3 weeks of failed scout reports, and then wrote a 4-word response across the cover page. Verify and send more. Nora Gill knew none of this. She was at Loom 7, 14 hours into a Thursday shift, and had no means of knowing whether the system had worked, whether Henshaw existed or was already captured, or whether the bolt had survived all 14 checkpoints intact. She had sent something into the silence and received nothing back. She simply kept weaving. That, in itself, required a particular kind of courage that no military citation has ever been designed to describe. Escalation. The second cipher bolt, Lot 448-D, September 4th, carried updated information on Confederate cavalry movements through the eastern hill country, including a secondary supply route that had been invisible to Union planners since August. The third, Lot 461-A, sent in late September, contained a near-complete inventory of the Macon Depot's ammunition and medical holdings. By the time the fourth bolt left the dock in October, James Henshaw had refined his decoding process to under 40 minutes and had begun sending Nora's intelligence directly to a signals officer in Chattanooga, who had been promoted in part on the basis of his unit's suddenly improved intelligence picture. The Confederate Army had no awareness the corridor existed, but Nora had identified a structural vulnerability that she could not design away. Every bolt she produced was logged with a loom of origin code in the mill's production records. Lots 441-C, 448-D461-A, all from Loom 7, all routed toward Nashville. If anyone ever cross-referenced loom of origin against destination patterns, a visible thread would emerge across the records. It was not standard practice, but it was not impossible. She had written about this risk in her private notes as early as August. The loom is its own record. I cannot erase what the loom wrote, but I can change what the clerk reads. Josiah Wyeth, the procurement clerk, received his loom of origin notation from the floor supervisor's production board each morning. The board was maintained in a small office at the rear of the floor. It was updated daily by the supervisor himself and left accessible to floor staff for reference purposes. The supervisor took his breakfast at the loading dock each morning from 7:12 to 7:18. 6 minutes. More than enough. On November 3rd, she entered the supervisor's office at 7:13 carrying a thread sample card. A legitimate reason for any floor worker to be present. The pencil hung on a string beside the production board. Loom 7's designation on the morning manifest read 07. She changed it to 02. 11 steps to the board, 11 steps back. She was at her loom at 7:15 with 57 minutes before Wyeth's arrival. Lot 477-B, shipped November 7, 1862, was logged in Confederate Army procurement records as originating from Loom 2. Loom 2 had never produced a bolt bound for Nashville. The trail was broken. And then, on the night of November 14, 1862, a Confederate provost officer named Captain Aldous Stern arrived at the Findlay Mill with a satchel, a clipboard, and a different set of questions entirely. He was not investigating the bolts. He had received a tip about a lower floor worker named Caleb Rouse, a man who had made careless statements to a neighbor and had been reported to the local military authority. Stern interviewed 6 workers, found nothing useful about Rouse, and then, as a standard procedural measure, requested a copy of the mill's complete production records for the preceding 6 months. The floor supervisor handed them over without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? They were production records. They documented cotton. They told the story of a mill doing exactly what the Confederate Army had requisitioned it to do. Stern tucked them into his satchel. He thanked the supervisor. He walked across the dock, climbed into his wagon, and disappeared into the dark beyond the river road. Nora Gill stood at the loading bay door and watched until the wagon's lantern was gone. She did not know his name. She did not know what he had taken. 6 months of loom logs, 6 months of lot numbers, destination codes, manifest entries, and loom of origin notations that had seemed completely ordinary until the night someone with the right question looked at all of them together, somewhere on a desk in the Macon Provost office. The 6-month record of Loom 7 was about to be read by a man who was very good at finding patterns in paper. She went back to Loom 7. She ran a new threading sequence through the selvage card. She started the next bolt. The shuttle fired, the harness dropped. The loom showed nothing of what she was thinking. Captain Aldous Stern spread the production records across his desk on the morning of December 8th and began at the beginning. Not at the anomalies, not at the suspicious entries. He began with page 1, column 1, and he read forward through 184 days of cotton mill output the same way a man reads the grain of a piece of wood, not looking for the flaw, looking for the pattern of everything else, so that when the flaw appeared, he would know exactly what kind of normal it had interrupted. He worked for 4 hours on the first day. He drank 2 cups of coffee and did not stand up once. By the time he turned the last page, the winter light through the office window had gone gray, and he had filled 3 sheets of paper with columns of numbers in his careful, close handwriting. He blew the ink dry, stacked the sheets, and went home. He came back the next morning and found what he had been looking for. The net tightens. The Findlay mill had produced 1,080 finished lots across the 6-month period. Stern tabulated every lot against 3 variables: loom of origin, lot weight, and destination code. It was not a sophisticated analysis. It did not need to be. The simplest questions, when applied to large amounts of data, were often sufficient. Loom 7 appeared 214 times in the lot records. That was normal. A standard output rate for a high-volume broad loom running extended war production hours. What was not normal was the subset. Of those 214 lots, 9 had been routed north through the Confederate supply chain toward Nashville. Every other loom in the mill showed either 0 northbound routing or a single incidental lot. Loom 7 showed 9, spread across 5 months, all through the same procurement channel. He drew 9 small circles down the left margin of his paper, 1 for each lot. He connected them with a straight vertical line. He stared at it for a long time. Then he found something else. Lot 477-B, the most recent lot in the northbound group, was logged not as Loom 7 but as Loom 2, a single deviation in an otherwise unbroken sequence. He drew a box around it, separate from the 9 circles. He held his pencil above the paper for a moment without writing. What he was looking at was either a clerical error or the first sign that someone had realized the Loom 7 pattern existed and had taken a step to obscure it. Those 2 possibilities required entirely different responses. He put on his coat. He went to the mill. The visit lasted 23 minutes. Stern walked the upper floor with Birch, the floor supervisor, and asked 3 questions. Whether loom assignments changed frequently, whether workers ever operated multiple looms, and whether the production board entries were made by Birch himself or delegated. Birch answered all 3 without hesitation. Assignments were fixed. Workers did not typically change looms. The board was Birch's own hand. When Stern asked to see the board for the current day and compared it against the lot entries in his records, he found no obvious discrepancy. Lot 477-B showed Loom 2 on both the board and the historical log. He thanked Birch. He left. He was not satisfied. A man who is not satisfied keeps moving. Across the corridor in the supply tent outside Nashville, James Henshaw hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a single stretch since October. He was running a one-man intelligence operation inside a system that did not know it had one. And the particular madness of this arrangement was that he could not tell anyone the intelligence was coming without explaining how it was arriving. And he could not explain how it was arriving without potentially destroying it. His one attempt, a formal report to Lieutenant Caldwell in September, had ended with the report fed into a lantern flame in Caldwell's voice, low and careful. Son, if the information is coming in and they haven't stopped it, the last thing you do is write it down anywhere that can be captured. Caldwell was right. Henshaw knew he was right. He went back to his tent and decoded bolt number 5 alone. By December, he had decoded 9 bolts across 5 months, 1,247 individual selvage entries, and the intelligence they contained had contributed to 4 operational decisions in the Middle Tennessee corridor. He knew this because he had seen the results. A cavalry raid redirected around a Confederate position he had mapped. A supply convoy rerouted away from an ambush corridor his report had flagged 3 weeks in advance. What he did not see was any acknowledgement that the source existed. The information went out of his hands and into a machine that consumed it without memory. No one came back to ask where it had come from. On the morning of December 12th, he received Bolt 491-F from the supply rack. He found the selvage. He counted 4 inches from the tag end. The sequence that opened Lot 491-F was unlike anything in the previous 9 bolts. It ran 211 entries, the longest single cipher Nora had ever produced. And it carried not just movement data, but what Henshaw recognized, after 90 minutes of careful decoding, as a warning. A repeating 3-color sequence, embedded at intervals through the message. Rust, gray, natural. The same 3 colors 15 times across the selvage's length. He checked it against the cipher key. Rust, supply type. Gray, direction of movement. Natural troop count range. But these entries had no geographic designation attached and no time reference. They were structurally incomplete. They were not meant to be decoded as intelligence. They were meant to be recognized as a signal. He sat with the decoded sequence for a long time. Then he understood. The incomplete entries, the 3 colors that looked like intelligence but weren't, were repeating like a sentence said twice to make sure it was heard. Someone is close. I don't know how close. Keep receiving. She was still going. But she was telling him in the only language available to her that the ground beneath the system had shifted. He had no way to reply. He had no way to help. He could only decode what arrived. He could only wait. He filed the 12-page intelligence summary and went back to watching the supply rack. The problem. Nora Gill had identified Stern's method before she identified Stern himself. She did not know his name until January. What she knew, from the morning of his first visit, was that a provost officer had taken 6 months of production records out of the mill in a satchel, which meant that somewhere in those records was something that had attracted structured attention. She spent the evening after his first visit, doing what she always did when a problem required solving. She reconstructed the records from memory and read them as a stranger would. She identified the Loom 7 northbound pattern in under 30 minutes. Her first response was the one that seemed most direct. Destroy the corrective record. If she could return to the production board and remove or obscure the entries linking Loom 7 to the northbound lots, the pattern in the historical record would have no current-day counterpart to confirm it. But the production board entries were Birch's own handwriting, and altering them would require either extraordinary access or a level of deftness that she did not think she could maintain for the time required. She eliminated it. Her second approach was faster and worse. She calculated that if she could introduce a credible explanation for the Loom 7 northbound pattern, a legitimate procurement reason, perhaps a special order that had required her loom specifically, the pattern would resolve into coincidence. She drafted the idea across 2 evenings, a forged supplemental requisition, backdated to July, citing a thread specification that Loom 7 met and other looms did not. The forgery was achievable. She had seen enough procurement paperwork to approximate the format. The problem was verification. A provost officer who had already pulled 6 months of mill records was a man who would verify anything that looked like an explanation. The supplemental requisition would lead to the procurement office in Macon, where no matching record existed, and the forged document would become harder evidence against her than the pattern it was designed to explain. She eliminated that. She sat with the problem for 2 more days, and on the 3rd morning she found the approach that worked. Not an explanation, not a deletion, a competing pattern. If the Loom 7 northbound sequence was incriminating because it was singular, because no other loom showed a comparable pattern, then the solution was to make Loom 7 sequence appear to be one instance of a broader production behavior. Not unique. Routine. She needed 3 other looms to produce northbound lots in quantities and timings close enough to Loom 7's that an analyst comparing them would see industry-wide variation rather than individual targeting. She called this, in her private notes, the noise. She wrote 3 lines about it and then destroyed the page. The discovery. Getting additional looms to produce northbound lots required her to influence procurement routing without touching a single procurement document herself. She could not alter requisition orders. Those came from the Confederate Army, not the mill. But she could alter what materials were available to fill them. The procurement system at Findlay worked by material specification. A requisition specified thread weight, width, and color range, and the floor supervisor assigned whichever loom was currently running a matching specification. If a loom was running a specification that matched a northbound requisition, it got the lot. If it wasn't, it didn't. Nora had been watching the specification board for 14 months. She knew which looms were running which thread weights at any given time. And she knew that the mill's specification assignments were updated every 2 weeks by Birch, based on pending procurement orders. If she could shift 2 or 3 looms onto wider specifications during periods when northbound orders were pending, those looms would absorb northbound lots naturally, without any alteration to a single document. She influenced Birch's specification assignments through a woman named Mrs. Etta Dawes, who had worked beside Birch as his operations coordinator for 11 years, and whose opinion he trusted above anyone else on the floor. Nora did not tell Mrs. Dawes anything. What she did was raise what seemed like practical production concerns about thread tension management on specific looms at current specification settings in Mrs. Dawes's hearing during the kinds of casual floor conversations that Mrs. Dawes carried to Birch as her own observations. Twice in November and once in early December, Birch shifted loom specifications based on concerns that had originated 3 conversations removed from Nora Gill. The result? By December 18th, lots from looms 3, 7, and 11 all showed northbound routing in the current month's records. The Loom 7 pattern was no longer singular. It was now one data point in a mill-wide statistical distribution that any reasonable analyst would read as standard procurement variation. When Stern later compared the November record against the December output, he found exactly this. He stared at it for a long time. Then he crossed out the vertical line, connecting his 9 circles. He was still watching, but now he was watching the wrong shape. First, success. The noise system bought time. She calculated it bought her approximately 3 weeks before Stern identified a new angle. She used 12 days of that window to produce Lot 491-F, the longest and most complete cipher bolt she had yet assembled, and rooted out of the mill before January ended. The threading took 4 evenings on her own clock, worked out on paper first, and then transferred to the selvage card with the precision she had developed over months of practice. The intelligence encoded in Lot 491-F's 211 selvage entries covered Confederate positions, supply reserves, and movement schedules across the full corridor between Macon and Chattanooga. Everything she had accumulated since October, everything she had been holding while the noise system stabilized the record around her. Lot 491-F left the dock on January 4th, 1863, under a standard procurement seal. It passed 14 checkpoints in 11 days. On January 15th, it arrived at the Nashville depot and was pulled from the supply rack by James Henshaw at 3:40 in the afternoon. She did not know it had arrived. She had no way to know. She had sent it into the same silence she had been sending everything into for 6 months, with no confirmation possible and no courier left alive to bring one. She had simply calculated that it was better to keep moving than to stop, and so she kept moving. Escalation. Stern returned to the Findlay mill on December 22nd. He came alone. This was different. His first visit had included Birch, the procedural inclusion of the local authority figure, the standard courtesy of a man who was still gathering basic information. Coming alone meant he had moved past basic information. It meant he was now looking for a specific thing, and he did not want Birch's reactions alerting it before he found it. He went to the loading dock and asked to speak with Otis Fell, the dock supervisor. Fell was a large, slow-moving man who had worked the Findlay dock since 1855 and possessed the particular quality of memory that develops in men who spend their careers moving physical objects through a fixed point. Not analytical memory, but a deep, specific recall of anything that deviated from the expected physical flow of his station. Stern showed him a handwritten list. 9 lot numbers written in the same small columns that filled every page of his analysis sheets. He asked Fell a single question: whether he remembered anything unusual about the loading or handling of any lot on the list. Fell read the list twice. He thought for a long time. The dock noise filled the silence, the grinding of the river against the pilings, the weight of loaded wagons against the dock planks. Then he said, "Lots like these move through here every day, Captain. I couldn't tell you one from the next." Stern held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he wrote something on his pad. "You're certain?" Not a question. A confirmation request. "Yes, sir." Stern capped his pen. He did not thank Fell or shake his hand. He walked off the dock and back to his vehicle without speaking to anyone else. It was a 12-minute visit. What Nora would not learn until years later was that immediately after Stern left, Fell walked to the water barrel at the end of the dock, dipped his hands in it, and stood for a long moment with his back to the mill. He had recognized 4 of the 9 lot numbers. He had loaded them himself. He did not know what they meant or why a provost officer was asking about them or who on the floor might be responsible for whatever was inside them. But he had looked at that list and made a decision in the space between Stern's question and his answer. A decision that required no deliberation and produced no outward sign of any kind. He never spoke of it. Stern had not gotten what he came for, and he knew it. His investigation now shifted to a different method entirely. He sent a formal request through Birch's office. The names and floor assignment dates of every worker who had been on shift during the specific dispatch weeks of the 9 northbound lots. It was a cross-reference analysis, the kind of work that reduced a list of 90 names to 20, then to 5, then to 1. It was the method that always worked in the end, given enough time. He had scheduled the first round of worker interviews for the second week of January. Nora did not know this. She was completing the threading card for Lot 491-F when Stern's request arrived in Birch's office. She was at Loom 7. The shuttle was moving. The selvage edge was taking shape beneath her hands. 12 feet of it completed. 28 to go. Each entry placed with the precision of someone who knew that the margin was the only place left to hide the truth. Cliffhanger Lot 491-F arrived in Nashville at 3:40 in the afternoon on January 15, 1863. James Henshaw pulled it from the supply rack, unrolled 12 inches of the bolt to find the selvage edge, counted 4 inches from the tag end, and began. He decoded 211 entries in 1 hour and 49 minutes, his fastest time yet. He organized the results into a 12-page summary, folded it into the dispatch envelope marked Signals, Priority, and carried it across the depot yard to the Signals tent at 5:33 in the afternoon. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he returned, a Signals officer was standing beside his decoding table holding Lot 491-F at a slight angle to catch the last of the afternoon light through the tent opening. The officer's name was Lieutenant Emmett Wynn, transferred 6 weeks earlier from the Ohio Division. And he was 31 years old and very thorough, and had no reason whatsoever to know what he was looking at. What he saw was a 7-color thread sequence running in a deliberate, non-random repetition pattern along the selvage edge of a piece of Confederate mill cotton. He had received, in November, a captured Confederate counterintelligence circular describing suspected Union methods for concealing coded communications inside civilian textile shipments. The circular had included no specific method, only the category: textile and fabric goods, selvage and border regions, systematic color variation. Wynn set the bolt down carefully, the way a man sets down something he knows is important before he fully understands why. He pulled a report form from the shelf beside the tent entrance. He sat at the corner of Henshaw's table and wrote for 9 minutes. The report stated that he had discovered a bolt of cotton fabric originating from Confederate-controlled textile production in Macon, Georgia, containing a systematically repeating color sequence in the selvage thread, consistent with a coded communication system of unknown origin and purpose. He requested that the bolt be classified as counterintelligence evidence and that a formal inquiry be opened into the Macon textile corridor. He stamped it with a priority classification marker. He placed it in the Signals dispatch pouch. Henshaw came through the tent entrance at 5:44 and stood for 1 second in the entry, taking in the entirety of the situation. Wynn at the table, the report form, the bolt, the dispatch pouch lying open. He understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. He understood that a report was about to travel east through Chattanooga and then south toward Macon, stamped with a priority classification, describing the origin of the most valuable intelligence source in the southern corridor. He also understood that he could not explain why the report was wrong without becoming the subject of a counterintelligence investigation himself. He stood in the tent entrance for 1 second. Then he said, "What did you find, Lieutenant?" He already knew. He needed to hear how much. Wynn told him everything. The report left Nashville in the Morning Courier at 5:15 the following day, heading east. It would reach Chattanooga within 4 days. From Chattanooga, the formal inquiry chain would route it to the Confederate Provost Authority covering the Macon district, Captain Aldous Stern's office. The system that had passed through 14 Confederate checkpoints for 6 months without a single inspector's second glance was now about to be handed, directly, formally, in writing, to the one man in Georgia who had already been circling it from the other side. The report from Nashville reached Captain Aldous Stern's desk on January 29, 1863. It came inside a captured document transfer envelope, stamped with a Union priority classification, the ink of the original stamp overlaid by a Confederate signals notation in a different hand. Stern read it without sitting down. He got to the 3rd paragraph, stopped, set the report on his desk, and picked up his own analysis sheets from the left-hand stack. He read both documents simultaneously, moving his eyes between them in the careful, unhurried way of a man who has learned over many years not to let surprise accelerate his thinking. 4 minutes. Then he set both documents flat, aligned their edges, and stood looking at them. He had been working the same problem from opposite ends of the same road. He had just watched both ends arrive at the same point, the convergence. The Union report described a 7-color selvage edge cipher on a bolt of Confederate origin cotton, lot number 491-F, arriving at the Nashville Quartermaster Depot. The report identified the cipher as originating from Confederate-controlled textile production in Macon, Georgia, and requested a formal inquiry into the Nashville Depot for a Confederate agent receiving coded transmissions. Lot 491-F was on Stern's northbound list. He had written its number himself. He had 4 months of analysis pointing inward toward the Findlay mill. He had 90 worker names cross-referenced against 7 dispatch dates, and he had been planning to reduce that list to a name through interviews beginning the 2nd week of January. He had the strongest inferential case he had yet assembled in 3 years of provost work. And now, in the same document that confirmed everything he suspected, he had a problem that none of his previous work had created. The Union report described the cipher as a Confederate operation. Messages traveling from Macon to Nashville, received by a Confederate agent inside the Union Depot. The inquiry it had opened was pointed the wrong direction, toward the wrong city, hunting the wrong person. But it was running, and it was official. If Stern now opened a parallel investigation into a Union agent inside the Macon mill, based on evidence he had obtained by reading a captured Union counterintelligence document, he would be required to disclose that source. He would be required to explain that a Confederate signals office in Chattanooga had been systematically reviewing captured Union correspondence and forwarding selected contents to the Macon district without authorization from the regional command. His commanding officer did not know this practice existed. Stern had known for 4 months and had said nothing, because the intelligence was useful and the practice was efficient, and some arrangements work better when they are not examined. Disclosing it now, in the course of a case he could not close cleanly anyway, was not a viable option. He spent 3 days sitting with it. On the morning of the 4th day, he opened the locked left drawer of his desk, placed the Union report inside, and locked it again. He noted in the Findlay investigation file that the inquiry had reached no actionable conclusion. He wrote 6 words. Pattern inconclusive. Investigation suspended pending evidence. He closed the file. He moved to his next case. He did not open the drawer again. The list of 90 worker names sat in a folder above the drawer. Nora Gill's name was on it. She was number 31 on a page of 34. The interviews were never scheduled. What Henshaw did in Nashville? James Henshaw had 48 hours to solve a problem he could not explain to anyone in the building without destroying everything he had been protecting for 5 months. Wynn's report was in the dispatch system. There was no mechanism to withdraw a stamped priority document once it had entered the courier pouch. What Henshaw could do, and what he sat in his tent methodically designing through the night of January 15th, was produce a counter record so institutionally credible that the inquiry would close before it reached anyone capable of acting on it. He wrote the counter memorandum in one draft, without corrections. He had spent the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning deciding exactly what it needed to contain and what tone would produce the specific bureaucratic response he needed. Too tentative, and it would invite a follow-up question. Too technical, and it would prompt a referral to someone more qualified. It needed to read as the tired, precise correction of an experienced logistics man identifying a junior officer's genuine mistake, respectful but definitive, with the flat confidence of a person who has been counting things in this building long enough that his counts are not questioned. He wrote that Bolt 491-F had been examined under his direction as part of ongoing quality verification, and that the selvage color variation identified by Lieutenant Wynn was consistent with a documented production irregularity in Macon District wartime cotton, an inconsistency caused by thread rationing that produced non-uniform selvage coloration without any coded intent. He cited no sources. None existed. The memorandum ran to 9 lines. The signals officer overseeing Wynn's inquiry read it the following morning and sent back 4 words. Noted. Inquiry closed. Return, Bolt. The inquiry had lasted 9 days. Henshaw folded the signals officer's response and placed it in his field chest beneath his spare uniform. He carried it for the rest of the war and for a long time after, across 3 moves and 2 jobs and a marriage, before putting it in the back of a farm ledger on a shelf in Coshocton, Ohio, where it stayed for 44 years. The buried truth. Nora Gill did not know how close it had come. She never would. She knew that Stern had stopped coming to the mill because she watched the river road every morning from the upper floor window, and after January his vehicle did not appear. She knew that the worker interviews had been canceled without explanation because Birch mentioned it in a Thursday morning briefing as a routine administrative update, and she was standing close enough to hear. She knew that lot 491-F had cleared all 14 checkpoints because no alarm followed it south. She did not know about Wynn. She did not know about the counter memorandum. She did not know that the system had survived not only through her design, but through a collision of institutional self-interest on both sides. A collision as accidental as anything human machinery produces when it runs too long without maintenance and develops in the space between its moving parts, a gap just wide enough for one person to pass through undetected. She wrote in her private notes in March of 1863. February passed without incident. March the same. I believe the danger has withdrawn, though I cannot say why. I will keep going. She kept going. She sent bolt 12 in March, bolt 13 in April. She adjusted her timing cycles, maintained the interference lot noise, and altered her loom designation entries when the pattern required it. She was meticulous. She did not slow down. She had started something, and she intended to finish it. And she had no definition of finished, except the end of the war itself. In total, Nora Gill sent 23 cipher bolts through the Confederate supply chain between July of 1862 and March of 1865. Each passed 14 checkpoints. Combined, that was 322 individual military inspections. 322 times a trained Confederate procurement agent handled a bolt that contained a complete Union intelligence report along its edge and found nothing unusual. Not once in 3 years did any inspector turn the cloth to its side and look at the threading running along the margin. Not once in 322 examinations did anyone ask what the colors meant. The last bolt left the Findlay dock on March 14, 1865. 26 days later, on April 9th, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Nora Gill walked off the upper floor of the Findlay Mill on an afternoon in May. She did not look back at Loom 7. She had spent 1,140 days on that floor. She left without ceremony, the way she had always worked, without drawing attention, without waiting for acknowledgement, without any outward sign of what she was carrying out of the building alongside her. 4 suppressions. The first suppression was Confederate, and it was an accident. After the war, former officers reviewing the Macon district's provost records found Stern's Findlay file. They found his production record analysis. They found his cross-reference columns and his northbound lot list and his notation about an inconclusive pattern. What they did not find was the Union counterintelligence report, because Stern, when he locked it in his desk drawer, had logged it separately under a captured materials category that was transferred to a different office when his department relocated in March of 1864. That transfer generated a misfiled entry. The misfiled entry was never corrected. The drawer document ended up in a bundle of miscellaneous Confederate intercepts that were boxed and stored in a Savannah warehouse after the war, where the boxed bundle sat for 11 years before the warehouse was reclaimed by its original owner, who burned its remaining contents in 1876 to clear the space for timber storage. Stern's investigators looked at the file and found an inconclusive inquiry with no breach identified and no method described. They noted it and moved on. The man who had come closest to finding the cipher believed for the rest of his life that whatever had been happening at the Findlay Mill had never been confirmed. The second suppression was Union, and it was a contradiction nobody compared. Henshaw's counter-memorandum describing the selvage pattern as a thread rationing production artifact sat in the Signals Section archive. 13 months of Henshaw's intelligence summaries, drawn directly from those same selvage patterns, sat in the Quartermaster Section archive. Both documents were real. Both were filed under Henshaw's name. The contradiction between them, that the same color sequences he said were meaningless, had also produced 12 pages of verified military intelligence per bolt, was absolute and obvious to anyone who read both files side by side. But no one read them side by side. The signals and quartermaster archives were cataloged by date and department, not by source. The two files never shared a room. The third suppression was Henshaw himself, and it sat on a shelf for 44 years. In the spring of 1879, in a farmhouse in Coshocton, Ohio, James Henshaw sat at a kitchen table on 3 consecutive evenings and wrote a complete account of the selvage cipher in longhand on 7 sheets of paper. He described the oilcloth key, the 23 bolts, the 9 months of decoding, the Wynn crisis, the counter memorandum, the 12-page intelligence summaries, all of it. He folded the 7 sheets and slid them into the back of a farm ledger. He returned the ledger to its shelf. He did not write an address on the outside because he did not know where to send it. The woman who had built the system was unknown to him except as a source, and he had never learned her name or her county or anything about her beyond the precision of her cipher entries, and once the warning she had woven into bolt 491-F's selvage in rust and gray and natural thread. He died in 1903. His son inherited the ledger. His granddaughter sold it at an estate sale in 1961 for 35 cents. The buyer kept the ledger and threw away the paper inside it. The account of the selvage cipher, the most complete record of the operation in existence, was disposed of as waste in the autumn of 1961 in a county in Ohio, where no one knew what it was. The 4th suppression was the simplest and the most total. Nora Gill never told anyone. She returned to the county north of Macon after the war and lived quietly for 46 years. She worked as a seamstress. She kept a kitchen garden. She was known as a precise, capable woman, reliable, self-sufficient, not given to talk about herself. The war had taken a great deal from a great many people in that region, and private reticence looked like ordinary grief from the outside, which was convenient. She came close to speaking once. In the spring of 1893, a neighboring woman named Clara Ames, who had lost her husband and her eldest son to the war, and who was sitting with Nora on a porch in the late afternoon, as women sometimes did in those years, allowing the silence between them to mean everything that words were insufficient for, asked her simply, "Did you do anything during the war? Did you do something?" It was not quite a question. Nora looked at the road in front of the house for a long moment. Then she said, "I worked in a mill." Clara Ames nodded. They sat until dark. Neither of them spoke again about it. How it was found. The house north of Macon changed hands 4 times between 1911 and 1987. No one in those 76 years went below the floorboards of the back bedroom. In October of 1987, a demolition crew arrived to clear the interior before the structure came down. On the second morning, a 27-year-old named Roy Chisholm was prying up floorboards when his bar hit something solid at a depth of 7 inches between the joists. He worked 4 boards loose and lifted the tin out with both hands. It was approximately the size of a hardbound book, sealed with what had once been oilcloth and was now a dark, stiff material that had fused to the lid over the decades. He carried it to the window and set it in the light. He continued his work. At the end of the shift, he took it home. He opened it that evening at his kitchen table with a flathead screwdriver along the seam. The oilcloth seal broke. Inside, on paper that had gone the amber gray of old newsprint, were 31 pages of writing in pencil, so faded that the first thing Chisholm thought was that The pages were blank. He angled one toward the lamp and held it there for a long time until the marks resolved into text. Numbers, column entries, dense compressed handwriting that moved across the pages without margins, as if the writer had been conserving space carefully. He could read fragments. Loom 7, Lot 441, selvage card, 7 colors, 4 inches from tag end. He did not know what any of it meant. He knew it was very old and that someone had buried it deliberately. He brought it to the County Historical Society the following week. It sat in an archival box for 6 years. In the summer of 1993, a graduate researcher named Thomas Ogle arrived at the Historical Society studying wartime textile production in central Georgia. He had been working through the collection for 3 days when the archivist, Patricia Ledger, mentioned the Chisholm donation, not as research material but as a curiosity, the strangest thing to have come through the door in her 16 years. Ogle spent 4 hours with the 31 pages under a magnifying glass and a lamp borrowed from the reception desk. The first hour produced fragments. The second hour produced the cipher key itself, written out in full on page 9 in Nora's careful hand. 7 color assignments with their category designations, numbered and clear. He read it twice. He put his pencil down. He looked at the wall of the archive room for approximately 10 seconds without blinking. Then he picked up his pencil and began writing very fast. He had held enough primary source documents in his career to know the feeling of one that changes the shape of the room. This was that feeling. He requested a conservation transfer to the university archive. 18 months of cross-referencing followed. He found Stern's suspended inquiry in the Confederate provost records. He found 21 of Nora's 23 lot numbers in Confederate procurement ledgers. He found Henshaw's counter-memorandum in Union Signals archives in Nashville. He found the December board notation in the Finlay family papers. Loom 2, December 13th to 15th, assigned N. Gill. He did not find Wynn's report. It remains in a Tennessee records office today, misfiled in 1866 in a folder whose exterior label reads Miscellaneous Signals Correspondence, January 1863. No one has opened it since. Ogle published in the Journal of Civil War History in 1995. 40 pages. The first documented account of the selvage cipher and the woman who had run it. Well reviewed in the academic literature. Little read outside it. Resolution. Nora Gill's name does not appear in any military record produced by either side of the Civil War. She appears in 5 census documents between 1850 and 1910. In 1860, she is a textile worker in Bibb County, Georgia, age 21. In 1870, she is a seamstress north of Macon. In 1880, her name is spelled wrong. In 1900, she is absent entirely, counted in a neighboring county where she happened to be visiting. In 1910, she appears correctly for the last time. Her obituary that September described her as a lifelong resident of this community, remembered for her industry and her quiet manner. She sent 23 cipher bolts through 322 military inspections across 3 years of war. She designed a counterintelligence system using thread, borrowed loom time, stolen minutes beside a production board, and a neighbor's medical leave. She survived not one, but 2 convergent investigations, one from the south, one from the north. Through a combination of precision, patience, and the particular accident of institutional machinery, that locks when its gears are too close to admitting their own failure. She was not a spy in any formal sense of the word. She held no commission, no rank, no code name. She had no handler after June 9th, 1862. Everything that came after that morning she designed herself, refined herself, and defended herself in plain sight, in a room of 340 people, under noise that swallowed speech and heat that punished thought. She lived 46 years after the war without telling a single person what she had done. The weight of that silence is not something any archive can measure. It appears only once, sidelong, in a sentence she wrote in her private notes in the winter of 1864, when she was 2 years into the work and had not spoken about it to any living person for as long. I wonder sometimes if silence kept long enough becomes permanent. I wonder if I would know the difference. She buried those notes under a floorboard. She kept working. In the end, the loom did exactly what Mrs. Addie Cook had always said it would. It showed everyone what she had done. Not in the season when it mattered, not while generals consulted maps that her thread had made more accurate and convoys took roads that her cipher had confirmed were clear. But eventually, with the slow, undefeatable patience of a truth that does not require permission to remain true, it surfaced in a metal tin, under a pry bar, in the hands of a demolition worker who could not read the writing but knew enough to carry it through a door. 125 years, hidden in thread, written in pencil going gray on paper going amber in a sealed box beneath the floors of a house in a county that no longer remembers her name. She was at Loom 7 when she built it. Nobody saw her do it. That was always the point.